Hi, and welcome to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, perinatal psychologist, Dr. Kat. We have another great episode for you with our guest, Dr. Ellen Chance. She's coming on to share her experience of postpartum anxiety and postpartum OCD, and also the amount of shame that she experienced that ultimately prevented her from sharing her experience with people that she loves and getting the help and support that she deserved. She talks about what that experience was like, as well as what it was like to come out of that shame experience and begin to seek healing. Dr. Ellen Chance is a counselor educator and founder of Whole Counseling and Wellness, a mental health private practice based in Florida. After her experience through perinatal mental health disorders, she received advanced training in perinatal mental health and is now serving the perinatal population. I'm grateful that she is on sharing her story, especially as somebody who's in the helping profession, because for people in helping professions, going through mental health challenges can be additionally complex because as a helper, we often feel like we are not ones who should be seeking help. And I think it's an important message for all of us to remember whether you're in the helping profession or not, you always deserve to get the help that you need. All right, let's hear from Ellen. Welcome, Ellen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Kat.
I'm happy for you to share your story, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but that's what we do here. Share
Right.
stories and deepen understanding. And I think in particular, in as it relates to anxiety and OCD, people still have a lot of questions about what kind of what that is and how it impacts people, and even have a hard time recognizing it in themselves. So stories like yours are really important to share, so that other people know what to look for, and also how to seek help. So yeah, I'm happy for you to start wherever you'd like.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you. I agree. I think it's something that I've been much more vocal about in recent years. Something that I carried. Um, well, I say carried. I mean, I certainly carried it alone for quite some time. And I know we talked a little bit about like how shame is at the root of that. So I think maybe I'll start there is just, how shame can really drive the symptoms of anxiety and OCD. It certainly can perpetuate it. And it can keep you in a place of isolation because,
Totally.
you know, you share some of the thoughts you're experiencing, you share some of the irrationality behind those thoughts and honestly feeling horrified by the thoughts that you're having. And I think for me, but for many people that I've worked with, it's, well, if I share this, how am I going to be perceived?
Right.
How are people going to handle that information? And how are they truly going to help? I think is another piece, right? Like, what are they going to be able to do to support me? So when I had my daughter, she will be 7 soon, and I've shared previously that it was not what I expected motherhood was going to look like. There were definitely signs that I was struggling during pregnancy. Just being really preoccupied, um, really concerned that something was going to go wrong the entire pregnancy, even though there was no indication of that.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was going really well. I was very healthy, as was she. But I remember even early on, Googling miscarriage rates.
Mm-hmm.
And then feeling like, okay, I've gotten past that threshold where the rates are relatively low now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved on to the next thing to worry about.
Got it.
So it was almost like, well, once I get to this threshold, I'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I just have to get past that 12-week mark, or I have to get past, trying to think of another example, the strep B test.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember those apps that we all subscribe to and consume, that oh, your baby's an avocado or your baby's a mango.
Right.
um what started off as something I was using because it was very exciting and informative actually became something I was engaging in to um try to alleviate fear, try to feel
Right,
informed.
right, right.
And it just made me fearful of so many things I didn't have to be fearful for. So, for example, in those apps, right, like they're um, breakdowns of like what you can expect at your next OB appointment.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, they list things that you could expect that could go wrong, right?
Right, right.
And that's where my mind went. I latched on to that.
Yeah.
Um, I remember, during pregnancy, really, really getting fixated on certain uh, milestones. And once I got to that milestone, this is what I could be told is
Mm.
going to happen to her.
Okay.
So even like the
Anticipating all
anatomy
the bad
scan.
things. Uh-huh.
Yes, yes. So there was signs of that in pregnancy, that I just kind of chalked up to, well, I just don't want anything bad to happen, right? Every
Sure.
mother would
Right,
experience
right.
this. I didn't necessarily perceive it as abnormal, or unhealthy or not serving me well. I was like, well, this just must be what it's like to have your first baby.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then um, it then latched on to delivery. And I was convinced that something terrible was going to happen in
Mm.
delivery. My mind was taking me all different places of what could go wrong and what would happen to her.
Is this like all throughout the
And
last trimester, or was it?
yes,
Uh-huh.
yes. I mean, it was definitely, I remember vividly just like ruminating over it and, having a good shower cry here and there,
Mm.
thinking like, I wish I could just stop this thinking, right?
Of
And
course.
um, I ended up begging my OB to give me a C-section.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because I was so convinced something was going to go wrong. And if we could control the environment, right,
Right.
that everything would be okay. And I've had, knee surgery in the past, and like surgery seems safe, right? Like what could go wrong? Which is so not accurate, but that's what my mind was telling me. And so um, my OB said, absolutely not. You're gonna, there's no reason for you to have a C-section. You're gonna have a, wonderful birth, and I did. It was long, but it went well, and she was healthy and happy, and thriving. And I think the next stage was okay. Now she's here,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a lot of feeding issues. So
Okay.
she was having um, a lot of trouble with latching. Just breastfeeding was a real struggle. I was working with lactation consultants. I was, consistently going to the pediatrician and um, being told, she's not gaining weight and you're going to need to supplement. Um, and for some reason, I mean, I think we know that in our culture, obviously breastfeeding is promoted for many reasons that are completely valid, but I never had anyone tell me this doesn't have to be the case if it's a detriment to your well-being,
Mm. Right. You
right?
rarely hear
I,
that.
yeah, and I didn't. Like I
Mm-hmm.
in this period, I did not hear that. I did hear from the pediatrician like we'll supplement while she's
Mm-hmm.
figuring out, and um, but looking back, I remember being at those pediatrician appointments and clearly not being well, right? Like very, very easy to cry, very fearful, asking so many questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that, in hindsight, I'm like, gosh, you would have thought maybe they would have checked in on me.
Okay. So no like
Right?
questions, no screening tools, nothing like that to check on your
Mm-mm.
symptoms. Okay. Right.
Right, right. And so, I think that experience there, I put a ton of pressure on myself. I was even feeling like, oh, well, I have to supplement. That means I'm inadequate. This isn't, I'm not doing what I should be doing as a mother. I should be able to do this and make this work. Um, the women around me who I had seen as models, as mothers, they just made breastfeeding look so easy. Um, and I definitely felt a lot of inadequacy because of that. Not to mention she was up like every hour eating,
Oh,
which,
right, right. So you're not
like there's
sleeping.
that too.
Uh-huh.
There's that too. Um, so, there were a few things that I look back at now and say, okay, risk factor, risk factor, risk factor, for experiencing the exacerbation of symptoms that I did in postpartum. And um, the OCD truly became all consuming at that point. I would say like it
How far
really,
into postpartum are you talking?
I would say it was really around the probably 4 to 5 week mark
Looking back,
where
do you
we were
think it was like
having,
ramping up over that time? Okay.
yes,
Uh-huh.
yeah. I think for sure there was a lot of it occurring during pregnancy. I just didn't regard it as that.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I would say around the 4 or 5 week mark, it really became all consuming. It was like, I always call it like the recorder you just can't turn off, right? It just keeps
Mm-hmm.
going.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it felt, a recorder in my brain that I could not stop. Um, and I didn't really open up to anyone about it. I had opened up to my sister and my mom and my best friends, my sister-in-law. I had shared with them just, this is hard. Many of them saw me struggling, but I was never transparent about,
Mm-hmm.
here's where my mind is taking me.
Okay. Was that transparent enough to them that they mentioned any concern for you or kind of checked in on you? Like I'm just thinking of what it looks like on the
Yeah.
outside to other people sometimes does
Hmm.
not match what it feels like on the inside to us.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I was pretty good at concealing it in the sense. I think there were a few moments in that period where the walls really came down.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I remember vividly being in a Barnes and Noble with my mom at the little Starbucks they have in the Barnes and Noble. And, I think we had gotten a coffee and sat down, and I just broke down crying.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the moments where I was like, I'm really struggling. And I shared with her, I said, I'm scared,
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, I think I, I wish now I would have opened up about the thoughts, because the thoughts were what I couldn't turn off.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I opened up about like, oh, this is hard and I'm feeling down and I'm feeling alone. I feel like I'm inadequate. Um, but as far as the OCD, I was almost very intentionally concealing that.
Oh, okay.
I think, yeah. If I'm being honest, I think I
Sure.
was too concerned about how I would be perceived if I was completely honest about my
Mm-hmm.
symptoms.
Were there
Um,
like are you talking about intrusive thoughts specifically, or were there
mhm.
other types of things that became obsessive?
Yeah, so a lot of intrusive thinking. I was just as in pregnancy, I was concerned that something was going to happen to her. That's completely what my OCD latched onto. I was so worried about her getting sick,
Mm-hmm.
excessive hand washing,
Mm-hmm.
lots of rumination on things that could happen to her.
Got it.
Um, there was a Today Show story that in the midst of all of this, that was broadcast about a family who lost their baby, because a family member kissed the baby and the baby contracted herpes. And that just really sent me on a tailspin. I was
Yeah,
convinced. And that was one of the questions I was asking the
that's tough.
pediatrician at the time. I remember saying, how, if they contracted her, if she contracted herpes, what's the, incubation period? When would I know? How did I
Hmm.
was like prepping for something
Yeah,
that
yeah. And stories
could
like that
happen.
really do. It even would maybe raise some concerns for people in general. But if you've got
Hmm.
anxiety on board and OCD on board, it just like
Hmm.
absorbs it almost automatically.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it tricks you to believe like this is something that you have to spend this much time worrying about,
Right. Right.
right? And preventing.
Right.
Um, yeah, so excessive cleaning, fear of contamination. And then it also latched on to sexual abuse. I was watching an SVU, Law and Order SVU.
Hmm.
Again, this is like I'm consuming something, right, in the
Yeah.
media,
Yeah. Yeah.
and my fear latches onto it. And so, it was a instance of a child being sexually abused in the episode on SVU, and it really again just consumed me that this is something that could happen to her.
Mm.
Meanwhile, she's 4 weeks old, right, in my immediate care
Hmm.
at all
Hmm.
times, and clearly not a present concern or something that was happening. It was just my mind was like, this could, how could you prevent this?
Hmm.
Who could do this?
Hmm.
And it's these intrusive thoughts feel so I want to say like violating, right? Like it's like
Yeah. Right. To you.
disturbing,
Yeah. Yeah.
violating.
Oh,
Right.
yeah. Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's pretty much, how it showed up for me in postpartum. And certainly, I think the hard part was that I'm a professional in the field of mental health. Um, at the time earning my PhD. And I think perhaps that's part of why there was so much shame and there was also so much effort to conceal in the sense of like, well, you know, I should know how to fix this. I should know how to address this.
Right.
Um, and I certainly can't open up to people about this, is essentially where I was mentally. And
Right.
it's so contradictory to, I mean, our training as
Hmm.
professionals, right? We know that we can't treat ourselves. We know that we should seek help if we need help. We work day in and day out to reduce shame and stigma.
Right.
But yet here I am living it, and it became so relatable to
Hmm.
why so many people I had worked with, right? Like it was very eye opening
Yeah.
that this certainly doesn't discriminate. Doesn't matter your education, background, training, knowledge of mental health. Um, it really doesn't. It can impact anybody. And that was not something I was anticipating.
Right. It does come as a shock. And I definitely identify with that sentiment of not feeling like you can know, feeling like you're the professional, so you should know and you have
Mm-hmm.
to figure it out or hide it. That happens to a lot of people anyway. And then you add on these additional layers of whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, your profession or and professions can bring in all kinds of different stressors,
Mm-hmm.
depending on, certainly like nurses could feel this, or
Mm-hmm.
other medical professionals or people in military, or like there's so
Mm-hmm.
many different ways that our jobs also add on this additional layer, that
So
you don't
true.
necessarily anticipate before you're going into it. Like, you don't think, hey, I'm going to go into this and have to deal with some really intense mental health changes.
Yeah.
It's a surprise.
It's yeah, it's absolutely a surprise. And that's such a good point about how just different, different training and knowledge and background can also perpetuate that feeling of shame, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, or, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
professional in a helping field in particular, I think could drive a lot of people to isolate.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it kind of shuts you up or shuts you down to feel like you
Hmm.
that shame that you were talking about. It's
Hmm.
really powerful.
Yeah,
It's very silencing. So, like
right.
for you, mm, what were the things you would tell yourself? Um, I guess I don't know if that's the right way to ask it for you, but like, what was the internal process? Like, if you felt like telling somebody about it, what happened after that?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think the first thing that would come to mind that would kind of hinder me or stop me from opening up was just um, probably honestly fear of judgment,
Mm-hmm.
fear that I wasn't going to be met with understanding,
Right.
um, especially because so much of what I was thinking was horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to logically reason that this is not happening right now, right? This is not something I have to worry about. But yet, like I said, that recorder just, I couldn't turn it off.
Right.
Um, so it was like, well, logically, I know that what I'm doing is anxiety, right? It is grounded in anxiety. It's grounded in intrusive thinking, and it's becoming obsessional. It's leading to compulsive behavior. Like I was able to recognize all of that.
Oh, wow.
Uh,
That's great. In one way, that's great.
in one way, in
In
one
one way.
way, right?
Not in all the ways.
But
Yeah.
but in the way of like I can't stop it, even though I know what this is.
Yep.
Um, so I was like, well, if I open up about these horrifying, intrusive thoughts and this experience, um, I'm not going to be met with understanding, and
Mm-hmm.
people are going to perceive me as like I'm losing my mind,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the idea that I would say to somebody, I'm worried about my daughter being sexually abused. I think about it all the time. I have visuals of it that are horrifying,
Right.
right? Like
Yeah.
my mind feels like it's playing tricks on me.
Right.
Um, yeah, I guess it was really who's going to get it, who's going to understand, and if I tell the people I love, they're going to be really concerned about me.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is some part of that you don't want people to be concerned about you?
Probably.
Yeah. I asked that because there's this really interesting I don't know what the right word is, but like a flip side of the coin where that feeling of just being so overwhelmed by what you're feeling.
Hmm.
And I guess just to put it in broad terms, to not want to like burden anybody or it doesn't always feel like burden, but just for lack of a better word for right now, it's like the push and pull of needing that help and also not wanting to need that help is
Yeah,
really, it sucks.
it does. It
It's
does. And you're spot on with that, right? It's again, which could possibly tie back to some of the work that we do in the mental health field. It's like, we carry a lot.
mm-hmm.
We hold space. And what I've seen is, not very often do we ask others to hold space for us. And so, especially for me, that feels a bit foreign. In that time, I mean, much more so now. I'm much more open. I've learned a lot since then in the last 7 years, but the version of me that was so vulnerable in that postpartum period certainly I don't think burden is how I felt. I didn't want people to be concerned about my well-being and my mental state,
Right.
like being unstable or
Right.
Yeah.
Like think that for them to think it was worse than it was, or that um
Or
yeah,
honestly, how bad it actually was.
right,
Yeah.
right.
I mean, it was never the situation where, and I think that I hear this from so many women, right? It was never the situation where I wanted to harm my baby, harm myself, had intrusive thoughts about harming myself or harming my baby. And so I felt like because it's not those two things, trying to, because it's not those two things, should I even worry anyone over this?
Oh, I see.
Should I just figure this out on my own?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right. That was part of it. And then of course, like, we're all human. It's like the perception of others was certainly a factor as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's really, really tough. I don't know. I think maybe this is true for therapists more often than I'm not sure. But because we're are also help givers, we hold space
Hmm.
for people. Um, sometimes I've heard this that when the people we care about, even when they're worried about us, we try and hold space for them too.
Hmm.
It's like so overwhelming to
Yeah.
be juggling all of this and still just trying to come to terms with how you're doing yourself, and then to
Hmm.
have this awareness that somebody you care about is worried about you, and um, like the the level to which your our need to care for things just expands if
Right.
other people know.
Yeah. That's very true.
It's like too much. It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
another version
absolutely.
of overwhelm.
Hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And um it was interesting because at one point I felt like, is anyone truly like seeing me?
Mm,
And years ago, like I want to say maybe 2 or 3 years ago, my sister-in-law had a baby 6 weeks prior to me. And we were kind of, just talking about that period and what life was like for us. And she was somebody who was very influential in me coping. But she said, I wasn't sure I was going to get my sister back.
mm,
And when she said that, I was really actually taken aback because I didn't realize that from someone else's perspective, I was struggling that much.
right.
Right? Like I knew it internally, but
Yeah.
because I was like trying to conceal it and,
Mhm.
be intentional of like, I'm carrying this alone. I was taken aback that she's like, yeah, I wasn't sure if I would ever get my sister, my best friend back. And it really, it was shocking, honestly.
Mhm.
And I said to her, I was like, wow, like you really saw me as different. She said, oh, yeah, you had completely changed,
Wow.
just running on high anxiety and
Wow. Huh. That's interesting. Right. So maybe we think we're hiding it better than we are.
maybe,
it's
maybe
it's hard
so.
to hold. It's hard to hold that. I mean, there's um, mm, it's really really tough.
Yeah.
So okay, so some people around you had a sense that something wasn't quite right, but it sounds like
Hmm.
nobody knew for a little while, at least.
Right. Right.
What was the kind of process for you of you, I guess, realizing what was going on and or beginning to share it with other people?
Um, so I think when I always call it when the fog began to clear,
Mm-hmm.
I think things gradually started to improve. My daughter, the feeding was was going much better. And that meant she was sleeping much better. And that meant the feelings of inadequacy were decreasing. And I began to feel more confident in myself as a mother. Um, I began to, return to work, which I think was very good for me.
Mm.
I think it gave my mind like something intellectually to focus on,
Right.
other than be in this preoccupation. So that was a very healthy transition for me in many senses. Um, so I felt like once I started to recognize myself again, I was much more willing to open up to people about the fact that that was the hardest 3 to 6 months of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but honestly, it really wasn't even until, starting to work as a volunteer for Postpartum Support International and leading support groups that I became much more willing to be transparent, open, vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
about the degree to which I experienced postpartum OCD,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right. Yeah. It does take some time for sure.
Hmm.
And not that everybody has to share their story. You certainly don't have to.
No.
Yeah, that process of going from kind of hiding it to being more open about it, hmm, um, you know, for me anyways, like I had to kind of test the waters a little bit at a time,
Hmm.
like say one or
Hmm.
two things and kind of see how I felt, see how other people were responding, even if I knew they
Hmm.
were like caring, loving folks.
Hmm. Right.
It's there's such vulnerability in sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's probably pretty indicative of like you want to be able to gauge how people are going to respond and what their perception is going to be of the information you're giving them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what feels like the element that holds you back. At least for me, that's very much how it felt,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, once you realize, oh, you're met with compassion and you're met with empathy, and there's also other people who can relate to your experience, that is single-handedly the most healing part, I think.
Yeah.
It's like, this wasn't just me.
Right. That's pretty huge. Was there something for you that drew you to start volunteering? Like, did you know for sure if what was going on for you was postpartum OCD, or yeah, what was that process that drew you to the work?
So I definitely, even as I was experiencing it, I was able to say to myself, I know what this is.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that was just because of my background. To that point, though, I, at that time had essentially 8 years of education towards this degree in mental health. And we really don't learn about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders to the degree that you would need to in order to treat this population and serve this population. And so there was so much I did not know.
Right.
So for example, yes, I knew what I was experiencing was OCD because I was able to identify I'm having obsessional thoughts. Those obsessional thoughts are leading to compulsive behaviors. But I didn't know that obsessional thoughts about sexual abuse is actually incredibly common
Mm-hmm.
in perinatal OCD,
Mm-hmm.
incredibly common.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me was normalizing. I was like, okay, this wasn't just something that's wrong with me,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, and so I slowly began to learn more because of my experience.
Yeah.
I also um, realized how underserved this population is, and also how little, at least in my area, how little access there was to trained professionals.
Yep.
So when I went to have my son, I was trying to be proactive and wanted to take a completely different approach to pregnancy and postpartum by seeking help. And there was really nobody in the area that was trained. And so that was very much the reason why I said this is something I feel called to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it really started with just volunteering with PSI and being a peer supporter, and then kind of going from there and professionally now being in this community of serving the perinatal population.
That's great. So, in throughout your journey, what were the things that you found were helpful for you?
So I think with what I know now and the ability to look back on the experience, I did recognize that sleep was hands down one of the number one factors I think that made my symptoms worse,
Mm.
but also better.
Mm-hmm.
And so as soon as my partner and I, we kind of found, even though she was still waking a lot, we found a better system of
Mm.
we're not both up at the same time,
Right.
creating opportunities for protected sleep where, at least I was getting a 3 hour, maybe 4 hour stretch of sleep versus every 1 to 2 hours. That was a huge game changer. And so that is certainly something I think we need to prioritize and educate people on, right? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, you're sleep deprived and part of that's unavoidable, but we can put practical supports in place for the individuals who are caring for the baby to have protected sleep.
Yeah. It's necessary.
So that, yeah, that was a huge one. I think too, a lot of mindfulness based activities were helpful. So things that brought me back to the here and now. And that certainly wasn't consuming media. That certainly wasn't consuming social media. That was more so reading a book or cooking or going out for a walk and being in nature, being outside, engaging with my baby, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being fully present with her and playing. So those types of moments were really helpful in taking me away from the rumination, taking me away from, giving merit to the intrusive thoughts. It's not that they weren't occurring. It was more so that I wasn't going down the rabbit hole of
Sure.
giving them my attention. So that was helpful. I also think finding some sense of normalcy again.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think a lot of what I was doing was isolating. I was really scared to even like take her out because of
Mm-hmm.
fear of contamination, her getting sick. And so I was cooped up.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I started making her more a part of my life versus feeling like I had to completely isolate and attend to her 24/7, I started to improve, right? Like getting out and being with friends and going and doing things with her, getting her around other people. I
Right.
began to realize everything I'm fearing is not as big of a fear as
Mm-hmm.
I'm making it out to be,
Mm-hmm.
right? She can go around others and not come home and, spike a fever.
Yeah.
Um, so exposing myself to the things that actually made me fearful was certainly helpful. Um, and then, as I said, I think going back to work for me,
Mm-hmm.
it helped me have a sense of identity again.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Those are super important. It is so easy to get kind of lost in your thoughts or thought processes and worries.
mhm,
Just which is it's such an internal like feeling consumed by all of this stuff.
mhm,
Yeah, you really do need those touch points that are outside of you, outside of your head, so to speak, your
mhm,
thought process, to be tapped into what is really happening right now, as opposed to what you're worried about is happening or could happen. Those points are really powerful, and I appreciate that you're talking about sleep because yeah, for sure we know that it is a massive part of this, and that there are ways that you can negotiate with your partner or family or whoever's involved
mhm,
on how to get that sleep.
Yeah.
And these are the things that you're describing are, you don't need $1 million or, like a huge amount of money
Right.
to do some of these things. And that
Hmm.
is really what's needed for people to have accessible and easy, quote
Hmm.
unquote, easy to do things that don't
Hmm.
require a ton of money.
Yeah, so I do feel so much of coping through any perinatal mood and anxiety disorder is just like the practical things that day to day can make individuals feel better. And I think you also tapped into something. It's engaging your support system, um, and making them a part of healing, right? Whether that's healing through sleep or time to self or
Mm-hmm.
those things.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for sharing your story. People need to know what this looks like and feels like and sounds like so that they can recognize it within themselves. And it's just really important that you're sharing your story because, especially because OCD is still not understood as well as it should be just by the general
Hmm.
population. It's like clear that you didn't want to feel any of this. You were
Hmm.
doing the best that you could do under really difficult circumstances, and that you needed the help and support that everybody deserves. So, thank you for sharing today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.